These last 6 years have been drastic in the tectonic shifts that we've experienced in entertainment. The streaming wars are part of what I think has also gotten us here. He was the guy that figured out how to make The Matrix in 1999. And there's a film called Sing Sing that very famously used this model. If there is an Academy Award to be won for Best Picture, that's the producer that gets the award.
This is Produced With. Honest conversations about how great work gets made and the cost of doing it right. If you're a filmmaker, check out Saturation.io, the all-in-one production budgeting, payments, and actualization tool. Hey, Carolina, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Jens?
I'm trying to take cues from you. I feel like there's not many people that do this in our space, I guess, creating a podcast. Most producers seem to be behind the camera. You've taken this venture to be in front of the camera. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that?
Yeah, I think when I moved to LA, initially I came out here to pursue to Hollywood. I pursue acting. And so being in front of the camera and being sort of client-facing, public-facing has always been something I'm comfortable with and of interest to me. And when I pivoted into producing and started to see that, yes, these folks are behind the scenes, but they offer a wealth of knowledge that I felt was really untapped and in these in-depth, deep dive conversations that I just couldn't find anywhere else. I would get really frustrated by attending some panels where a producer would get to speak. And the questions that were asked, I felt were so rudimentary and elementary. And the answers were always very generic. It almost felt like the sort of, the sort of, what do you call it? The press version of that answer.
Yeah,
and I always wanted
the
PR version. Yeah. I always felt like the answer was the PR version of that answer. And I'm like, but I want to know this, and I want to know how you sustained yourself to get to this point where now you're on a stage and you get to celebrate your project, And I was also having a lot of conversations off mic with fellow producers and colleagues on the realities of what it means to do this work and walk this path of a producer, of an independent producer, of anyone within the producing umbrella, because I started to see misconceptions that existed around what it means to do this work, and the perception that people have is that, producers make all the money and have all the money, and some producers certainly fall into that, but the majority don't. And so I really felt passionate to embark on this 6 years ago now with Angle On Producers, really to help create space for these conversations, to create time capsules of these individual journeys that I thought were so fascinating and not really being exposed to the market, but also to learn and grow, because I was able to talk to people that at the time when I started, I really had no business talking to them, they weren't necessarily in my peer circles. And people at the same time were coming to me being like, oh, I want to pick your brain. I want to learn from you. And I'm looking to people 20 years my senior going, I want to learn from them. And so it felt like, all right, if I can have a place where I can have these time capsule nuggets of conversations, we can in a way all pick each other's brains and learn a little bit from the journey and being, again, deeply inside the experience of what it means to be in the shoes of a producer and not the perception that people have.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you've now, since in the 6 years, I think I got this right, have done over 100 episodes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's crazy. And I mean, when you consider other podcasters, it's 6 years. Some people do that in a year, depending on your frequency. But when I started, what was really important for me was to be an active working producer with a podcast. My goal was never to be a podcaster, right? It really was, you're hearing conversations from someone who's in the trenches, who's in the business, who's actively doing this, and not someone who had a hit a decade ago and now has an interesting perspective still, but isn't as tapped in the zeitgeist of what's really happening. And obviously these last 6 years have been drastic in the tectonic shifts that we've experienced in entertainment. And so it's been really interesting to I started the show, launched in 2019 and have sustained it throughout. But for the longest time, the show was really as I was available in between my own films and my own projects. And so there were some years where I would maybe put out 10 episodes because that's all I had the bandwidth for, The people that I chose to talk to were also extremely busy. So sometimes it would take 6 months to land a guest or a conversation, because they were shooting. So
Oh my gosh, I'm experiencing that now. Like, it's like, I thought I was going to do this as like a weekly thing. And it's like, oh, like it is very hard to schedule with talented, busy, working professionals.
Absolutely.
It's quite the task. But I mean, like, I know you feel like it could be slow and obviously, to each their own about how they feel about it. But I think of that stat that I've been seeing recently that like most podcasts don't even get to like episode 8. I think it was like, and so it's crazy to think like, they were saying like most successful podcasts, if you can get past 8 to 10 episodes, you'll actually like sustain, you can sustain. And that bar felt so low to me, like, cause I would have thought it's like hundreds or something that, but when you see like different people do it in whatever field that they're talking about, it feels like, that you could do 100 episodes pretty easily if you just like, did it once a week or something like that. But it's quality very difficult.
Quantity, right? I think it's one thing if I'm just hopping on a mic once a week and telling you what I think about what's happening. But when you are, or even if I had a co-host, which I don't, like that was not necessarily a deliberate decision. It was just at the time, I really wanted something low lift for myself because I know the gargantuan effort that is required and the amount of people that it takes to do anything in this sort of traditional side of entertainment. And I didn't want to be beholden to someone else's schedule or to a financier deciding to pull the plug 2 weeks out from me starting a project. And so for me, it was like, I just wanted to keep it as lean as possible so that I can sort of do it on my own accord. But the downside of that is that then, unless it's me hopping on a mic, if I don't have someone there, then you don't really have a reason to have an episode. But I really took a page out of, or a lot of pages really out of Tim Ferriss's books, many books. But, he was one of the OG podcasters. And when I launched to I listened to everything he had to say about how to start a show and the longevity and how you really need at least 100 episodes to even find your voice. And that was like so daunting at the time because it's like, wild. But in a way, I do think he was right because now that I've crossed that threshold, I listen back to some of those earlier recordings and it's hard. It's hard, man, because they're like you're
like you
still
said,
finding
time
it.
Capsule, right? It's cool to see the journey, but I agree. I mean, that's like with anything, right? Like your first film, your first short, your first whatever is always going to suck compared to, hopefully that's the case, and that it sucks compared to.
But you got to have your first and your second and your third so you can grow and evolve. And I think also like the Ira Glass quote is one that really sits with me often is that, you have to be able to like, everyone wants to be great, but to be great, you have to be willing to suck for a while to get to the great. You can't just show up and be great. And if you are, there's a lot of work behind the scenes that you've kept sort of swept under the rug in whatever lane you're doing that in. And it's an important part of the process. But I think especially now as we're in a time when it's like you can give AI a prompt and it can turn around something that some would say is great, it really removes all of that sweat equity that goes into like figuring out the thing, the critical thinking, the critical analysis that is into untouchable. It is not binary. And I find that to be a really interesting dialogue that I'm sure we'll get into around like the use of AI within specific fields like ours.
The willingness to show something that sucks, I think, is such a like powerful statement. Just because I think, like you're saying, now more than ever, it might be harder to do that when something looks really polished and you're not willing to like put yourself out there. But it does seem like that's the muscle that you're kind of building is not letting it like stop you from like creating, because you could have that kind of like decision fatigue or that kind of imposter syndrome or just something that blocks you from even starting. But the important part is starting. And then even if it sucks and then incrementally kind of growing, I think is like a wise takeaway from what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's, our humanity is inherently what makes us unique in what we're trying to do. And if you don't give yourself permission to suck, to fail, to figure it out, and you think you just need to have it all solved or from the jump, then you're missing, I think, a huge part of like what it means to have a human experience and the things that we're trying to do. And I know it's easier said than done because we all want to come out the gate being like great, but if you can embrace that is just part of like the evolution of whatever it is you're trying to do or who you're trying to become and what you're trying to do. It's like really important. And, you know, the messy parts of the journey for me are always what I've been obsessed with. Like another show that really inspired me was How I Built This with the guy Roz, right? Mm-hmm. And one of my frustrations with his show is that sometimes he would probably for time skip over, you know, the 7 years where things were hard and it wasn't working and that person was unemployed or, you know, sleeping on someone's couch. And then he would go to like, okay, and then you launched this product and it blew up. Great. But I'm like, I want to talk about those 7 years. Like, who kept you sort of going and showing up? Or did you just have a dull 7 years where you were just focused on surviving? Like, and out of that survival was this genius idea. Where that came from? Like, I'm really fascinated in the in between. And I think our industry, there's a lot of in-betweens that people don't talk about because you constantly are judged based on the last thing that you did. And everyone knows it takes years to do anything great. And yet you're expected to constantly be operating at this level that is like not realistic for the bar of the entertainment industry. Yet there's almost like a shame around being in the in between jobs, in between a project taking off. And a lot of people struggle in that in between, you know, and I think right now at a time when so many folks that have been traditionally employed and, you know, like normal jobs are sort of joining the dark side of being independent and freelance and having to be entrepreneurial, and how they're thinking about, all right, how do I take all of my skill sets? How do I take what my value add to a conversation or to a project and monetize that and really think of myself as like a brand? And it's interesting to see them kind of join this side and be really having to contend with that in between and in a super unique way because of the shifts that we're experiencing in our workforce.
Yeah, it seems like now more than ever, there's those shifts, and it's kind of been like shift after shift. Like in the last couple of years, there's been kind of multiple things that I think have shifted the industry. Yeah. What is kind of like the current climate in LA, or maybe like in your world, in terms of like what you're seeing in terms of that in between or busy versus not?
I mean, I think in a lot of the circles I sit in, there's a lot of jobs that have been lost. We can see that from the market contractions and all of these acquisitions and mergers that have happened over these last few years that have really derailed a lot of traditional pathways for folks. And so I feel very sympathetic to people that maybe started at an entry-level job at a studio and worked their way up, or at a, you know, mini major or at a production company, and all of those companies may have shuttered, and now there's like fewer mid to upper level jobs available, and you have brilliant, incredible people that have spent 15 years climbing that ladder in the more traditional sense, who now are like, where do I go? What do I do? These jobs aren't coming back. And the people that are maybe getting those jobs aren't the most qualified people because of where those orders are coming from the top down. So there is this sort of palpable fear and anxiety, but I also think it's the grief. A lot of the conversations I have are around this grief of like, so you're telling me I invested like over a decade of my prime career building years and money making years only to get to the other side where now I'm supposed to catapult and supposed to be able to reach another higher tier of what I'm doing. And that doesn't exist anymore. It's just is not something you can even grab to climb. It's a completely different jungle gym you have to find. And so the grief around that I'm seeing, and certainly again with circles that I'm in with a lot of women predominantly, is really rough. It's really rough to see. So I think that there will always be the 1 to 5% of people that are doing fine and doing great and can weather all of the stuff like any industry. But the majority of folks, like, it's been rough. Frankly, it's been a rough 5 years. And I think the fires in Los Angeles, particularly in Altadena, and how they impacted so many wonderful people that have to start from zero potentially and don't really, maybe can't even afford to start that. in LA. It's just wild, to me. Heartbreaking, even.
Yeah, it's so heartbreaking. Are you seeing it disproportionately affecting? I love kind of double clicking into this because I haven't been able to talk to anybody else about it. But like you kind of you kind of picked on a group of people, which is the person that might have grown up in the studio system, right, or versus like maybe the independent filmmaker. For the person that doesn't live in LA and maybe doesn't understand that world as much, do you feel like that's who majoritively got affected, or are there like other types of like subset groups?
Everyone. I think everyone is impacted, and I think that's what's unique about this experience, right? There's been layoffs, there's been strikes, there's been a lot of these shifts in the industry, but this is the first time that what has occurred since 2023, since the double strikes that we experienced with the writers and the actors, really have shifted. And you have to zoom out even further, because what's happened is over the last 20 years, we've had the globalization of production, and we've had all of these countries and all of these places really make a compelling case as to why it makes more financial sense to go shoot elsewhere. And so jobs have been leaving for a while. And now we've trained and we have pockets of these brilliant, talented people all over the world. So keeping things in Los Angeles doesn't really make sense. So it's been a long time that it's been this trickle down where it's not just the creative, more high-level executives, studio peeps that have been impacted. It's everyone. It's definitely like a downswing into everyone. When I was working in Los Angeles pre-pandemic, almost every film and every project I shot was here, and that wasn't that long ago. And after 2020, it was like insane. It was just like everyone was in Atlanta, everyone was in Jersey or in New Mexico, and really following and chasing the tax credits. And so I share that because people would historically migrate to Hollywood, right? Because of what you could do here and the dreams that you could build here. And you would start at the bottom. If you wanted to go more in a traditional lane, you would maybe start at an agency and start in the mailroom. And from there, the agencies are the information hubs of the industry. And so from there, that's where you hear about openings at jobs at companies that how do you get those jobs? It's not posted anywhere, really. It really is a who you know situation. So the folks that would climb and move around within this traditional studio system were doing one thing. But in the last 20 years, we saw the rise of independent, right? The independent film movement and the ability for independent filmmakers and independent producers, which traditionally independent meant you were independently making a film or financing a film outside the system of Hollywood, of the studio system. And in the last 10 years, that's not really even the case, because people would call a film that had some funding from a studio an independent film. It's like, well, that's not really. They just mean it's a low budget film for a studio's regard. Like an A24 film is an independent film because it's independent of the traditional studio model, but A24 is a huge player in that space. It's a studio in its own right. So how can you compare that to a tiny, tiny budget indie that got put together truly independently with equity that, was found through relationships and friends and family? It just is different.
The technical low budget number is under 10 million, which still feels like a lot to a very indie type of film.
It still can be a lot depending on the scope of what you're doing. And maybe I'm losing the thread of the question and just rambling about all of the things, but I do think it has impacted everyone, right? So the sort of nepotism that exists within Hollywood, not just on camera, but with, folks that have legacy businesses, fathers who were gaffers and grips when Hollywood began, who have passed that knowledge on to their sons and their children, and they all go on. So this hub of talent that exists in Hollywood specifically is overlooked and is part of what when people talk about the talent that is here, we're not always talking about the on-camera talent that you would think of. We're talking about all the years of nurturing that have existed to create the industry here that functions to really support what audiences see, which is the final product. And you can go find that in other places, absolutely. But it used to be that you could only find that here, is my point. So you had to come here to make your projects. You had to find a way to be here and move here and exist here And in the last 20 years, that's all has changed tremendously. And on the one hand, it's wonderful because it creates so many opportunities for so many other people, without having to make Los Angeles even more crowded and the traffic even worse than it is.
Sure.
But the downside to that is that it's created this challenge that we are all working diligently to figure out on what does it look like to sustain production and a version of the industry here for the folks that are not these higher level studio folks, that are project based, that require, whether it's you're on the production side or the post side, that require these things to be in motion for you to work. So it really is a downstream of how it impacts everyone, at every part of the process. And I really feel like this is the first time in a long time that this has been the case, where everyone is truly impacted in different ways.
It does feel like it's been a little bit of the slow cooking of the frog. Yeah, I love how like you kind of didn't just say, hey, it was just like the last couple of years, but really the last 10, 20 years of like the kind of like maybe the certain decisions or certain things that have just happened in the world. I would say it almost feels like there's also a part of it that feels like technology has had to play in it. I'm sure like laws have had to play in it, tax credits, all the different labor laws, all the different things that I'm sure that had a part to play with it. Because I know, like, I'm sure this is for you as well, but at the time, for me to pursue filmmaking or producing, I had to move to LA. Now that's not really the case anymore. You can, to your point, you could, be in another country and still see like a very thriving part of the industry. And I feel like for me at least, like the technological revolution around like even cameras being more accessible, and like my first camera wasn't a film camera, it was a DSLR that could shoot video, and I was able to kind of hop in and do like an indie short or certain things like that. But it's kind of fun to kind of poke through that timeline a little bit. Like if we were to say like everything used to be in this like hub in like maybe like LA and maybe major markets like New York and like Miami or something like that, like outside of LA. What do you find some of the key kind of like moments in time that you feel like might have gotten us to this place? It's probably more easier in the last 5 years to identify, but do you feel like over the course of the last like 10 years, there were like any kind of like big moments that kind of has been the slippery slope of LA losing its kind of ground?
I think that when the streamers really began, I think when Netflix really started to make a play for creating original content and not just being a distributor and acquisitions play, that I think was a really big shift. And it's really tricky because, they disrupted the model in a way that actually like screwed a lot of people out of longevity with what they were able to do. I mean, think about any show that you loved watching from, I don't know, before 2010. Like people who were in those shows, actors, writers, producers, directors, even, those folks like probably never have to work again if they don't want to, because of the model and how it was set up and how you get residuals and how you get to have a piece of the thing being successful for the rest of your life. Even if it's not a show that you loved. I think about like Gossip Girl or Vampire Diaries or some of these like YA kind of shows that like I like saw one of those actors that like, I don't know, out of like a yoga class here in LA. And I was just like, damn, like most people don't even know who this one chick is necessarily, but like she doesn't have to work again. And now it's like, you're lucky if you get 8 episodes, right? With some of the streaming model and your ability to make money in perpetuity on that project is like, no, you're getting probably an upfront fee and that's kind of it. It's changing. The strikes have helped a little bit, but the way the system is set up for you to be able to sustain yourself in those in-betweens doesn't exist anymore. So we've gone from being an economy where you could rely that you had a job for 8 months out of the year because you were staffed on a TV show. That also meant you had production for that same amount of time or a little less, right? And now it's turned into gig economy. So I do think that like the disruption of the streaming model coming in, and frankly, all of Hollywood, then instead of saying, oh, okay, we're going to let these bigger players do what they're going to do, all of them investing an insane amount of money and time into trying to compete with Netflix, who had been slowly building in the background, doing the slow build of what they were going to eventually launch. And then for studios within a year to go, well, we're going to launch our own streaming service. And then the boom of jobs that created, that was never going to stick. That was always going to be unrealistic because it was not sustainable. Like, you cannot create content in the same speed that people are going to consume it. And it just, anyway, the streaming wars are part of like what I think has also gotten us here. And it was never a debate of who was going to win that war. Like, Netflix had already was already winning. So why the decision to invest so much time and money trying to compete with that instead of protecting a business model that really worked for a lot of people, that made a lot of people a lot of money, and you could be a normal middle-class person who came out here, got lucky, was talented, landed on something, and it changed your life. That just doesn't happen anymore for most people. And I do think that, like, when Netflix really started, like around that Orange is the New Black, House of Cards era, people started to go, oh, this is kind of interesting, and the model, and everyone got really excited by the shiny new thing, and unfortunately abandoned a model of traditional, certainly on the episodic side, that just really screwed a lot of people, really, frankly. And then the feature side as well, because then, obviously distribution and the theatrical experience. And you could spend a whole hour just unpacking one of these elements, and
So true.
I feel like I'm savvy in the history of the business of Hollywood, but there are people that are way more brilliant and tapped in than I am. And this is a quick plug for, I recently had Steve Papazian on my podcast, and it's a name that most people probably go, who is that? And he is one of the last like icons and giants of like the traditional Hollywood system when people made stars, when he was the guy that figured out how to make The Matrix in 1999. He was part of the movement of realizing we can't afford to do this in this way in Los Angeles. We have to go elsewhere. And that's why they shot that movie in Australia. And that was 1999. This was already happening, of realizing for us to make this happen, the technology isn't there. We have to go outside even our own system to figure out, how do we do this effectively? What's in the best interest of the project? But he was essentially the global head of physical production for Warner Brothers for 47 and a half years. I mean, he started at the bottom and worked his way up, and was in the studio system for almost 50 years before he retired. And it's like, how many people do you know today are going to have that kind of legacy in one company and to weather all the changes that happened at Warner Brothers, So he's really brilliant and has a very, very, more accurate finger on the pulse of the history of Hollywood and how we got here. So I recommend anyone listening who's really wants a deeper dive in that to check out his episode, because he's definitely like needs to write a memoir kind of guy,
I'd be curious, because I think what you're saying is so valid in terms of like how it's those kind of moments, especially the streamer wars and all that stuff, has been very disruptive and maybe in a very unhealthy way. If I'm playing devil's advocate, is there a silver lining or like a positive part to it as well, where yes, it maybe disrupted old Hollywood, but maybe it also allowed for more independence or more people to play in the game?
100%. I think it democratized the game in a way that the power players don't like as well. And that's great. But when you democratize, that also means that there's less money to go around and there's less opportunity, right? In the sense of like that huge financial upside. And one could say, well, isn't that better? Everyone gets a small piece of the pie. And I feel conflicted, because on the one hand, that, yeah, I absolutely believe that. And I benefit from that system, right? Benefit from those changes in a lot of ways. But when I look at how it's impacted the folks that it's like, you have these rooms, right? I think about rooms a lot because I spend a lot of time with writers, like that you would be able to get in a room and have like your career change. But then you look at like, well, who was in that room? It was historically 10 white dudes from elite schools, Ivy League schools, and then like one or two outliers. And now You can have rooms with all Black writers or all women, or a real diverse room that is representative of the show they're creating or of the world as it is, right? And that is very exciting. But what frustrates me is that those rooms don't have the same financial upsides as the rooms with all the white dudes did because of the model, right? And you can have all of this time spent in creating a show nowadays that like doesn't even go, or that only gets 8 episodes, whereas before you just had these commitments as to what was going to be on the air and how long it takes for audiences to really find and connect and identify with content. Like, I think that that is also part of the equation that I think is interesting, because I would really be curious to ask somebody who is 19 today this question of how they connect with what they're watching. Why is it that there's so many kids rediscovering The Office or some of these classics from my youth and clamoring for those kind of shows? Is it because they had the time to really grow and evolve and you really feel that human connection to these characters? Or is it a nostalgia play? I don't know. It's really fascinating to me. But no, I do think that every disruption brings a ton of opportunity. And I think it's about your perspective on how you look at it. So it's, I guess, why is it that we can't have disruption that doesn't have to then financially impact people that much is my frustration. You know, I think it's awesome that we have a platform with Netflix specifically that can reach global audiences in ways that, like, I don't know how you did that before so quickly and so specialized to certain cultures or certain languages. That's brilliant. That's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. But I guess that I want to live somewhere in between those two, and I don't know what that looks like or who's going to figure that out, you know?
Yeah, it seems like with most companies, I remember like reading this somewhere, and I'm going to butcher the actual quote, but for most companies, it's to grow, it's a race to the bottom, like to try to like do things cheaper, more efficiently, or you know whatever it might be. And I don't know what the full economics of it around like the streaming versus traditional or anything like that, but it is very hard to monetize in film. Is kind of, I think, part of the maybe the flip side of it. Yeah. Which how do you I'm still struggling to reconcile both of those things that you're basically saying as well. And I don't think there's a real right answer to it, but it's this idea of like, how do you grow, decentralize, disrupt, but then also make a living, or not even just make a living, like make profit. And like, that shouldn't be like looked down upon. Like, I think everybody should share in that wealth, not necessarily just a 1% of that or anything. But it feels like with what you're saying, there is kind of a disruption that's happening from the above the line and also like below the line. The above the line is slightly different than the below the line. And it's kind of what you're touching on, which is maybe not residuals anymore, or like the way that they would have had it like traditionally back in the day, being able to maybe like negotiate back end versus like just a work for hire fee and all of that stuff. Does because I would have thought that with the advancements of like the streamer wars and how much content is being produced, that it would have actually benefited the below the line because there's more work. Is that not necessarily the case, or do you feel differently about my distinction between the two?
No, I think it did. For a long time it did. You know, that's why we've seen this boom. Like when I made a film called Honk for Jesus in 2021 in Atlanta, which was still pandemic times, but not like post 2020 pandemic, there was no crew available. Like everyone was so busy. Like we had to fly out people from LA. Like it was just a boom in work. And that's great, but it's not sustainable, you know? And also what happens when you have like, I forget what the data was, but it was like historically the most things in production since like the entertainment industry began. You don't have enough qualified people to do those jobs. And so you have to bring people that are new, which is great because they get the opportunity, but it creates an inflated sense of self because you haven't had to start at the bottom. You're getting an opportunity to go be like, say, a DP of a tiny movie, whereas historically you would have had to like work your ass off for 3 years work your way up as an AC to get that opportunity. And now someone just hands it to you because they just need somebody and you are good enough. But you're missing all of the suck and all of the hard to get to that point, like we were talking about at the beginning. So when those jobs inevitably leave, like they did, Atlanta is a perfect example with, Marvel moving their campus back to the UK. Like all those people that for 5 years were like working their way and having, a moment that there's no jobs left for them. So yes, like when there's a bunch of production and a bunch of content in production, a lot of people get to be put to work, but it's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. There's not enough. And that's part of, I think, why a lot of filming had to leave Los Angeles too. There's not enough sound stages. There's not enough locations and space for all the production that needs to happen. And again, but that was never the case. It was like predictable. You knew there'd be X amount of TV shows in production that year, X amount of movies in production. So you kind of could gauge that. And then it just became a open door, open sesame, like unpredictable, a plethora of work, but truly unsustainable for everybody, I think. And also think about the lifestyle of someone who is project-based in production specifically. You're working a minimum 12-hour day, right? Like 12 hours is like the work hours, and you have to commute to and from. Yeah. So you have a 14-hour day every day, right? And then you finish a project, and then the next day you're back on the starting day one of another 30-day thing. That is not a sustainable life for a human. Like You can't do that in that way for 365 days or whatever that math would be, minus weekends if you get a weekend, depending on your position. So yeah, like wouldn't it be better if you could work like 7 to 8 months out of the year and then have a couple of months off to rest? Like, wouldn't that be fantastic? But that stopped happening with the way things shifted in your traditional pilot season and your traditional windows of when things would go. That's why most movies used to be shot in the summer, is because of how the television schedule happened. You would write and you would shoot in the beginning of the year. All of whatever got picked up would go into, would be ready to be shown in the fall. And then you had this like weird window in the middle where it was a dead window. And so films would be shot in the summer.
I don't know if you've seen that article recently that came out about how 71% of film budgets go over budget. It's crazy to think that this has become like a standard in the industry and you just kind of have to keep going with it. I don't know if you've heard of saturation, but saturation is the next gen budgeting tool that you can use to streamline all of your operations and your budgets and your finances on a project. It gives you really easy collaborative tools, and you're able to bring in your budgets and your actuals and your expenses all in one place. If you haven't tried it yet, go to saturation.io, sign up for a free account. It's really easy and quick to sign up. Is part of what you're saying there that for the sustainability of our industry, that it needs to be more like how like a traditional full-time job would be versus like gig economy? Is that 100%. Kind of the...
There is absolutely a way to be in production specifically and work 10-hour days and not have to put people through all of that, and have a real work-life balance, and have people who can still be home at time for dinner with their families and feel filled in themselves in different compartments of who they are, not just their professional identity, so they can show up to the job and be happier to be there and not feel like I have to do this because I have to put food on the table, right? I think it is important to think about the longevity and the sustainability of that. I think historically it's always been, well, you just do whatever it takes because you have this really finite window when you're in production. And so you just go balls to the walls. But if you're always in production, then you're not getting to have those downturns and the breaks that you need to sustain that. A lot of people get sick. A lot of people are exhausted. It's unsafe, especially when you consider driving. And that's not thinking about the PAs and the lower level jobs that are working even longer hours than that because they're young and they can do it. It's like, yeah, but then eventually, like, you're going to be in your 30s and you're going to be tired. And what have you done to your body for a decade? Like, all of that, I think, is really important. And a lot of folks have been thinking about that. Like, how do you create true work-life balance and sustainability when it is possible? It is possible to shoot like 8 to 10-hour days instead of 12-hour days, but it's not cost effective. Mm-hmm. And no one has been able to figure out how to make production the actual act of executing and making a movie or shooting something, the filming process, how do you make that more efficient? I don't know how you figure that out, because you're talking about hundreds of humans coming together in a very creative space to create art together. You can't automate that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, especially with project-based businesses, which obviously, like, we're talking about entertainment being, is that at least in the current traditional way, you may like hop from project to project. It might be new collaborators you're working on with that project. Mm-hmm. It might be a different team, or you might be bringing your team over to the various things. And it almost seems like to the ideal, the utopia of the model that I think maybe you're talking about is if studios or companies that are cranking out content consistently just hired everybody full time, and then they just went from kind of like how episodes work in like TV. It would seem like that they would just all work full time for the studio, and then they would just keep moving on. But is that realistic from the sense of creative collaboration, in terms of like, or would it be better that you're working with the same people over and over again on? I don't know if that's the solve. I just was thinking as you were talking, I'm like, oh, that seems like it could be a solve.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is just what old Hollywood used to be. You were under contract with the studio, and you were an actor. You weren't a movie star. You were an actor who was under contract, and part of your contract is that you were going to be in X amount of pictures for that studio. You were paid a salary to do that work in the same way other positions were. You were a salaried cinematographer. You were a salaried gaffer with Warner Brothers, and that's who you worked with. So whatever they had in production, whatever they were making, you were just helping them make it. You didn't have any say in that, You really had a few overlords plugging and playing, and that model worked up to a certain point. And again, I don't know the history deep enough to understand how it got sort of disrupted, but I'd like to think that in the 70s, when you had this rise of these auteurs and you had these brilliant filmmakers that came on the scene, you had Scorsese, you had these guys that were coming up with these ways of looking at telling story that were completely different from what anyone had ever really experienced. I think that's when the power shift started to go into, well, the filmmaker sort of holds the power. And what does the filmmaker want to do? And who does the filmmaker want to hire? Oh, this is Scorsese's DP, then that's who we let him hire. Whereas before it was like, no, this is you pick from what we've selected for you,
Yeah.
And that shift was important because it created, and how many generations of people did it inspire? I mean, it created a shift globally, the amount of people that have been inspired to become storytellers because of this era of cinema. And then you had that sort of spike again in I think the late 90s, early 2000s, when you had people like Robert Rodriguez who figured out how to make a movie for $500,000. That's insane, and you could be that guy. You could be that guy or that gal that could make something for $500,000, and you would sell it, get distribution, take it to a festival and actually have an insane financial upside while doing something that was different and gritty and took a risk, something that was truly independent that the studios could never touch. They could never do something that daring or that whatever the thing was, right? At the time, perhaps. And that's how you saw the rise of that. But I do wonder, it's in a way, I think that the way a lot of the streamers are functioning is very similar to that, right? If I'm Mike White and I created White Lotus, well, now I have an overall deal with Warner Brothers, which HBO Max. It's the same. It's the same version of that, where it's we want you to exclusively create with us and for us. Mm-hmm. And even within Netflix and Hulu, they have their preferred actors they want to be in business with. I'm sure there's some of that behind the scenes, but for a select few is my point. So what happens to everybody else?
Exactly. Yeah. That seems almost the shadow side of that is if it did become that again, which was old Hollywood, would that then prevent more people being able to do what we do currently? I don't know if I'd be able to doing what I currently do. Yeah.
It would, at least in that way. I think that's the thing. That's the double standard, right? In that way, yes, it would. You wouldn't get to maybe be at a company where you have a nice salary with great benefits, that's a tech forward company and all the wonderful things that comes with that. But you get to still do it independently in your own way. And maybe you're lucky enough to figure out how to do it in a way that is completely yours and sustainable, and you build your own mini empire, and you don't need that. It makes me think of people like Kanigra Dion, who has been dubbed like the Tyler Perry of YouTube, who is in Alabama and is a content creator and was just like, I want to tell stories. I want to do it on my own terms. And she just has empowered her whole community out of Birmingham to like build an industry. She's built an industry. She hires local talent. She hires kids from the community to be in her shorts and her videos, and she's built a little empire. Like, we've never heard of her, but she's doing great. She's doing better than most people, in fact. She has like multiple shows on her YouTube channel. They really cater towards like youth, young kids stuff, but the same kids that are on TikTok and their brains are going to like freeze over. And how could they possibly have the bandwidth to watch long form content? That's who she's making stuff for. So she's found her own niche and is doing it in her own way. And now I bet you in a couple years, there's going to be some play for like a Netflix or whoever to try to make an overall with her, to bring her. So it's like people that are building on the margins of that and doing it on their own terms, which is like super hard to do, by the way. It's obviously, this is like one success story out of many that probably don't work. But I do think that that's what it's exciting. It allows people like Kanigra to go, well, I'm not going to wait for traditional Hollywood to give me an opportunity. I'm not going to like climb this ladder that is truly vanishing as you're climbing it. Is sometimes what it feels like. I'm just going to go build my own thing. And when you build it, they come. And that's what we've seen time and time again. It's like when Hollywood is like, we got to get in with the influencers and the content creators and bring them in. It's like there's this disconnect of how you do that I find really odd, whoever's making those decisions. But
this is a great transition to another question I had around, we've been talking a lot about like maybe traditional and studio, but then the other part of our industry is obviously the independent part of our industry, which I'm wondering, do we hold to the same standards of everything that we've just talked about? Or is it different when it is your money or low budget, or like you're just trying to get something, a passion project for lack of a better word, or scrappy? How do you think about that when it comes to like the work-life balance, all the things that like we talk about, profitability, like is there a different set of standards that apply here, or is it kind of like anything entertainment kind of abides by what we just talked about?
When you say standards, can you define what you mean by that?
Yeah, like so everything that we talked about, like this full-time job, like approach to like sustainability versus gig economy versus how much you should pay people, or like profit sharing or work for hire. These kind of things that we just kind of all like set as like, these are the studio level or like the professional level like standards. How does that apply or reconcile with like indie?
I think the indie model is tougher because you have to keep the product that you're making as low as possible in many ways to have the largest upside for distribution and for sale. In a time when there's less and less of that, who are the distributors that are left? Like, no one's really taking risks. There's a lot of fear in the air. So who's left? It's a lot of the streamers. Few films get theatrical releases just to see what will happen, unless you have elements that make it less risky, i.e. named talent or named filmmakers, or you do it for a price point that is worth the risk to see kind of what happens. I think that's like the Blumhouse model, where you can really make interesting pieces of films for a certain price point within a genre. Because with certain genres, it's like, well, if it's horror, if it's thriller, people are going to turn up for a good time, kind of like no matter who's in it. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but it doesn't matter, right? There are these genres that people just will always kind of gravitate towards because there's a predictability, I think, that people really enjoy. But independent films sometimes are, filmmakers who are making the things that no one asked for, but everyone kind of needed and didn't know they needed. I think of Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like, what studio would have greenlit that movie? Who would have given those guys the chance to do the film the way they wanted to do it? And the Daniels have been very public in saying that, they could have gotten more money for their film, but they were really adamant about keeping the same team that they had grown up with, they had found their style with the same team of people, being able to shoot it in LA at that time. And they were able to do it for $10 million. But think about how much that film on paper does not cost $10 million. It costs at least double that because of all the VFX. That they were really brilliant in how they had mastered so many aspects of their filmmaking style that they were able to say, we'll do the VFX shots. We'll do all the things that feel expensive and scary and risky. We'll just do it. And we'll do it for the price point that you're telling us is what we have to take this risk. But their non-negotiables was like, we're shooting in LA. It has to be with our crew, with our people, because that's the way we maximize the investment, is mitigating that risk by having the people that we know we can trust, right? Yeah, we can go to Atlanta or some other state with a tax credit and there's like less risk, but it's actually a bigger risk to them because it's going to impact the creative. So I do think there's an element of that is interesting to think about. But also, like, I don't know, like, independent film is traditionally hard. And when you think about the production side, the project-based side, like the crew, they would say, yeah, I've been making a lot of money doing TV all year. Oh, what's one indie? I'll go off and do an indie. You're paying me like the least amount that you can pay with a union contract. But like, this is fun. This is different. You get to like take a risk. Everyone's taking a risk, and that feels fun and exciting because I believe most people who get into this industry are storytellers in their own right, and they want to be a part of making those stories, and they find their lanes and where they can fit into that. Not everyone can be the director or the writer or the actor. That's why there's hundreds of jobs behind the scene. They're all in support of that. They're all mini collaborators and storytellers to get the final story signed, sealed, delivered. But that's kind of what has happened is, well, there's less opportunities for that. And so there's more indie, but because budgets have gotten so compressed, you can't really make a living on indies like you used to for most people. And it's obviously the cost of living has gone up in America. I think the biggest challenge is with the unions and whatever, all of the wins that they had, which was fantastic. The union minimums now are so high that it's also a huge driver of why people can't afford to shoot independent films in the States like they used to. And again, that the number has to make sense. I'm tasked with this all the time. There are projects I consult a lot, and it's like, oh, well, we really want to shoot this in LA. We have this amount, or we've raised $200,000 to shoot a film. And I'm like, I don't know how you do that. Like, I don't know where you do that or how you do that ethically, legally. Like, maybe someone can figure it out. I just can't be a part of that at this stage in my career, but I empower people to like still create within the realms. But when I tell them like what you've written, what's on the page actually costs $2 million, they're like, why? That's crazy. And then you start to break it down and they're like, oh, okay. If you're paying people a fair living wage, and if you're looking at union minimums, your cost to just production, it doesn't end up on screen. But it does, right? Mm-hmm. The talent of the crew, all of that imprints, I believe, it makes it really hard to have those compelling arguments. And so I think you see more and more of like why production keeps leaving, but also why it's like, well, I can make this movie for $200,000 in, say, Colombia, or $500,000, and it's going to look like $3 million. And then if I can sell it for $2 million and maybe it has some box office success, I break even. And that's a win for everybody.
Because I feel like my hot take on why things are moving from LA, not only LA, but like Atlanta and some of these other places that you're talking about. I think everybody kind of rushes to the tax credit issue, which is important. I'm not saying that any incentive to shoot here is a good thing, but even with Atlanta having a great tax incentive, you're starting to see like people leave, and it feels like a lot of it has to do with the unionization, labor laws, and we should have safe and healthy labor laws. Not trying to say anything against that, but 100%. When you compare that to like shooting in another country, it is probably what most productions are facing, is trying to figure out like, how do I reconcile shooting this creative or making this thing for this amount of money or whatever it might be, and they're making these decisions constantly. But it does feel like that part doesn't get talked enough about. Like, do you feel like the most recent negotiation was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, or was it just already going to like naturally go this way? I'm curious because like nobody really talks about it from that standpoint.
Yeah. I do think it was not the final straw, but one of the bigger pieces of like, this is a huge win for the labor force and we want that. But you have to take into account, again, the globalization of production and how competitive other countries are, and the pipeline to distribution and the audience retention and and marketing and all of these other elements that are so not just about the production part of the pipeline to get something from execution to screen to finding its audience. It's like, how do you do that? You have to reverse engineer, like, who is this for? How do you get this to them so you have the highest probability of the thing you're making finding an audience, thus making money? That's the business. And it's really hard to do that. It's become harder and harder to do that. That's why the people that can have a devoted audience to something they're doing on YouTube, like, hold so much power over people that are maybe making more interesting content or higher production quality content, or telling stories in the traditional way. But you're throwing it out and being like, we don't know who's going to actually watch this or how much P&A you have to really put into getting something out there. In that same conversation with Steve Papazian, he was like, in the same way that the studios used to invest and make movie stars, they had real marketing dollars to get behind pushing projects. The marketing, the pageantry of it was part of like that charm. And now no one commits that kind of marketing dollar. So it's kind of like,
100%.
How do you reckon with that? How do you solve for X? Like, that's the biggest part of the equation. How much grassroots marketing can one do for any given project? It's so freaking complicated. But I also think that it's always tempting. I've always warned against this in the States specifically. It's always tempting to chase tax credits. But when you're looking at these lower price points of like sub 10, you have to consider what other costs are you going to potentially incur by going to a tax credit place where perhaps the labor isn't there, that the talent isn't there, and you're going to have to bring it from other places anyway, which is what happened on Honk. We were there at a very specific time when Atlanta was booming. There was not a lot of people available. We ended up having to bring a lot of people from LA, New York, even some department heads. And so the cost of putting those people up because of all the union minimums and mandates for distant hires, I wonder what that math breakdown looks like, because people think, oh yeah, you get 25%. And it's like, well, hold on, you don't. You're going to be audited on the other side. And the estimates you made on the front end of what you think you get may not be exactly what you thought it was. And now you have to explain to your investors why you told them you were only going to spend this amount. And now, JK, they're actually going to get $1 million less than they thought back, To
that point, to educate the audience a little bit, sometimes with these tax credits, some of the like rules around it is that like it has to be like people locally, like versus like flying people in. Right. And so there's this in-state spend versus like, oh, the whole production just gets 30% off. Well, it's like, no, my editor's not in Atlanta, or, whatever, the director's flying in, all this stuff. And it changes the math a little bit.
Every state has like very specific minutia of that. And you have to understand that. And also tax credits versus tax rebates. How long does it take to that? You're going to have to cash flow a part of that. How long does the post-audit process take? So you finish production. Is it 2 years before you get your tax return back? Like, are you able to cash flow that? Are your investors okay with that? Is it worth that just to save like $400,000? I don't know. Maybe. It's not a one size fits all thing, but a part of that, just as a quick fun example, is a lot of the tax credit states don't accept, like, for your purchases to qualify, they have to be physically made in that state. So if I'm buying a ton of stuff on Amazon or online, well, if the online headquarters of that store is in San Francisco, guess what? It doesn't count. If I'm using Airbnb to put up my crew and my cast, that doesn't count because Airbnb is not headquartered in that state. You have to literally look at even how you're spending that money. And a lot of people didn't know that and had a lot of rude awakenings thinking,
Yeah, because the state's incentive for even providing this is that you're bringing the money there, right?
Yeah, you're
Like, and
stimulating
so
the local economy, right? In what
exactly. And
ways? In what ways? Exactly. So it's sometimes we don't think about what that actually means and what the cost is to do that. And again,
do that.
sometimes it makes perfectly good sense. If you are creative, the film you're shooting makes absolute sense to shoot in New Mexico because it's set in the desert. Like you should shoot in New Mexico because of that.
Absolutely.
It benefits the product you're making. But if it's something that can kind of be shot anywhere because you're mostly indoors, you're in a house, like really running those models is really smart. But again, most people don't do that. They just look and want to plug and play. And they don't think about that back end part. And most people don't talk about that of like, hey, we went into this thinking we were going to get X and here's what actually happened. Like no one really gives you like access under the hood to see how these things actually function. You only get to understand them when you're in it.
Yeah. And some people are like maybe naively planning with that number in mind. So when they say the budget number, they're already including the tax credit number as well, which you didn't get, obviously, and you don't have there but it's kind of the weird creative financing that kind of happens within production that I've seen some people get burned from too, to the point that they get to the end of the rope and it's not there. And then they have to raise finishing funds or something to keep going. It's a very scary
and that's why like there is this narrative around independent projects constantly being on the brink of falling apart because anyone can get into the game and that's very exciting. It democratizes, anyone can be a producer in the independent space. You just put some money in it. If that's how you define a producer, sure. Anyone can find a cool project or have a friend with a script that they decide they want to make and now they're producing it. But there's so many nuance that again is not binary, that can't really be taught, that has to be like hard earned stripes that comes from years of being in the trenches. And that's the part for me that really upsets me as someone who has devoted a part of my career through the podcast of like helping demystify this. And still this myopic view of what it means to be, again, an independent producer who is trying to make a living as a producer versus the 1% of producers that maybe have huge fees that they get from their studio movie and now they're bummed because their $1 million fee is now $750,000, and that means one less Martha's Vineyard like trip or whatever for them that year, versus the people that literally are like having to have side hustles just to pay their rent. Like forget even thinking about owning a home. Like it just is like inconceivable. And there again, the perception that like, yeah, you make this movie and it does super well in the box office. That means the producer got rich. Well, not always. You have to look at how that project was set up and the waterfall and what percentage of the back end they own. And then there's the lack of transparency with the accounting on the back end.
Hollywood accounting is a very real term.
There's an allure, right, to what it means to work in certain aspects of this industry and certain positions. But when you really get into the reality of it, it's dark. It's dark and it's really sad. And I think it's why we're seeing so many people having to leave, having to pivot to something else, because it was already hard enough to be an independent producer 10 years ago, but you really had the opportunity of like, if you make something great for a certain price point, like you can absolutely catapult yourself to the next level, to working with certain kinds of filmmakers, to becoming a trusted right hand to a filmmaker that now the studio wants to poach and wants to give them their Marvel film. And that is less and less the case because you are essentially a scout, right? You become a scout for the agencies and for the studios, and you're investing years of your life making no money, developing these great filmmakers because you love storytelling, you love film so much, and they hopefully do well, hopefully get seen, they just get great distribution, but you're still left like having to teach or find odd jobs just to pay the bills. And then there's this like, oh, well, you're the producer, so you're fine, you're making all this money. And it's like, oh my gosh, like people just have no idea how relentless and thankless it is. And so when people want to just dilute the producer credit and just give it to anybody because they gave a note once or helped get this person on board, it's deeply upsetting for the producing community because it's like, who is the person actually left holding the bag when there's a problem? Who's the first call when there's an issue with the tax audit? That's the producer. That's the person that is responsible for the film.
What people don't realize too, like when people think like, oh, producers make a lot of money, but it's like, how long have you been on that project? Most people can kind of just make their hourly rate or day rate or whatever it is, and they're in and out. But you're probably still dealing with something 5 years later that like you're not making a day rate
That's
to
right.
like deal with or anything like that. And so when you kind of dwindle it to the amount of hours spent or whatever it might be, it's
years. Yeah. How do you quantify, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. You see someone's rate on a budget and you're like, oh my God, this producer is getting $100,000. And it's like, yeah, but they've been on this for 3 years and they're going to be on it for another 2 years. So when you divide that by 5 years minus taxes, they're not even making a living wage for this. Like Correct. It's not even quantifiable in terms of an hourly rate because I say when you're plugged into that matrix, you're in it every day, all the time. It doesn't matter. If there's a need, you have to be the person to handle it, to solve it. And there used to be a huge financial upside to be that person. And now it just isn't, because who gets the upside? Well, it's the star or the name that brings the value, that brings the financing. And those are the people that get like, celebrated.
And as we're talking about it, I love kind of your definition on this because you're so outspoken about producers and producing challenges and all that. Mm-hmm. How would you define a producer? Because like you're saying, the term has been very used and abused throughout the industry. And most people, even coming from the outside, don't even fully understand what it is.
Sure.
What would you say your definition of a producer is?
It's so complex because there's many types of producers on any given project. And to me, like a capital P producer, which is that produced by credit that everyone fights over, that is the credit, that is the person, if there is an Academy Award to be won for Best Picture, that's the producer that gets the award, right? Mm-hmm. To me, that should be the person who has been deeply embedded into the life of the project from start to finish. It's the person who just gets it done. Whatever it is that needs to be done, they get it done. Is it finding the money? Is it figuring out where we're going to shoot? Is it getting the set up? Is it giving notes on the script? Is it finding other pathways to get the project made? Is it exploring all permutations of how we make this one movie a possibility? That's to me what a producer does. It is very akin to a CEO of a company, except your company is one tiny project and you're mounting. Like on the independent side, every time you mount a project, you are the CEO of that company. And you're doing all the things a CEO would do. You're setting up the company, you're doing the hiring, you're figuring out your budget, you're figuring out the schedule, you're figuring out profitability, like all of that and sort of long lead planning based on one project. You're literally putting all your eggs in one basket for this one tiny company that you're building. So to me, that is the capital P producer, right? And then there's like this explosion of this executive producer sort of person who historically was perhaps someone who's not as day-to-day, but brings inherent value to the process. You know, maybe they are the author of that book that you've optioned, and now this is the material, the IP that this is built off of. Or they are the business partner of someone who is like integral to your team. And now what happens is giving away of EP credits, certainly because you are just trying to appease somebody because you don't have enough money in the budget. And so it's like, well, we can't pay you your full rate, but we're going to give you an EP credit. And that gives that person a sense of like, well, now I have a say in things because I'm a producer on the project. It's an inflated sense of like, of self, because you are coming in perhaps to certain conversations where you aren't needed and your input isn't requested. But then on the converse side of that, you know, there are EPs that are like, were there from the people who were there from the ground and developed that project. They were not day to day, but they were integral in getting that to where it is today. And they are an EP that merits and warrants that creative input. They make magic happen behind the scenes. They keep talent happy. They're dealing with these high level personnel problems. Usually a lot of managing of egos and personalities is a lot of what like a higher level EP person's doing, whether that's with your financier or with your talent or with some big element of the show. Or you're just the person that put in money, to your point, like how many independent films run out of funds. And so they're like, we need another $500,000 to finish the movie. What's the biggest, why would anyone sign up for that? Well, I'm going to give you an EP credit. Like, you're a producer on this movie now. That's exciting.
And there's even those that like just connect the money and get the EP credit as well. Like it seems like that's like a growing
and it's this
trend.
thing where it's like for the capital P producer who just is trying again to get the movie made, you just have to do it by any means necessary. And so sometimes I do think it's like, I don't want to have to give this person this credit, but this is the only way I unlock this big element that I need to do my thing. And so what's interesting is that the way that the model is different from how I understand tech companies. It's like, you're not investing, you're not getting shares of that project, right? You're not getting shares of like early seed investor money where you're like, I'll let you do your thing, but you've taken my 50K, my 100K, I'm going to sit back and you let me know. There's this sense of like, I gotta give you input because I gave you some of this. And I always wonder how we could bring some of this idea of how tech companies are set up or startups are set up into at least the independent model, which is very exciting. And there's a film called Sing Sing that came out last year that very famously used this model where they were able to figure out, we will pay you proportionate to the time that you've spent on the project. This is what the shares are. It's quantifiable based on time. So if you came in for a day, this is the piece. If you've been on it for 5 years, you get a bigger piece. It just makes sense. But that model only works if you can do it non-union. Because you have to contend with union minimums and residuals. And that's what makes it really tricky and sticky. So a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's like you have to be the person who is able to keep pushing it forward by any means necessary. To me, that's the producer. And it's about doing it with integrity, doing it with good humor, and keeping forward momentum. Like you have to rally everybody, and that means different things at different times. So it's a very complex, convoluted job that, again, on paper seems really easy. And when you're doing it really well, it's almost invisible because you don't feel it. Things are just happening. And the moment things aren't happening, the first person people will blame is the producer. The producer dropped the ball here. The producer dropped the ball there. Did they, or was that not their department's responsibility? Was it the location manager that dropped the ball? But it's easy to blame the producer because, again, at the end of the day, when there's a problem, who is responsible? Who is the adult in the room who has to go, I'm going to go deal with this. You guys stay, you know?
Yeah, you get both the praise and the blame. It kind of comes with the job, unfortunately. I love what you're saying about redefining the model here. And it's interesting just because of where I'm at now is obviously I'm producing, but then also I've started this tech company, and the differences in like how things are structured and how I'm bringing in people like is night and day. And I'm like craving for the industry to adopt what, not just technology, but like just generally what corporate structure like actually looks like in terms of, I think to your point, like the wonky way that like we've set up the business, including like waterfalls, like points and percentages and rates and all this stuff, and even like how things can circumvent the traditional waterfall, and you can like be on top of the waterfall and maybe like screw over like other people. It's not that way when you're talking about like just corporate structure and shares. Like it's all very transparent. It's very easy to like understand like, oh, like how much are my shares worth in this company, or like if this company sells, or if like it generates a profit. It's all like, you know, legally and just communicatively like just so much easier to like fully understand. Now there's things that like are there like preferences and stuff like that, but generally speaking, if it could work that way, I think it could fix a lot of the industry problems that we were talking about in the beginning of this conversation. But to your point, there's the powers that be, or the ones that kind of have like a grip on this industry. And it's why I think my bigger gripe with our industry is actually unions, like more than it is like anything else. There's obviously inherent good to why some of these things exist, but there's also kind of like a overreach or just too far that makes it really difficult. And then you get into this place where there's too much regulation or too much kind of like padding in here that is why AI or something else will completely take over, and then like you don't even have the human element at all. And in this thing that was created to protect the human might end up propelling a faster way for the human not to be involved anymore as well. And that's my bigger fear when I think of the industry at large. And so I don't know what the answer is to like kind of detangle that, but it feels like if we can address that problem, and to the point we were just making about like restructuring, and maybe it will start with indies, like to adopt more like what like Sing Sing did, to like keep going there. But that's what's, I think, necessary to really like redefine and reset the kind of like palette for hopefully everybody to like succeed in the industry.
Well, as someone who is like sitting in the intersection of both of those worlds, and I do think we are in a big season of disruption, which again, it's difficult, it's sad, it's really hard to see the crumbling of traditional systems. But the upside is it's rife with opportunity. And it's always like, it's going to shrink, people will leave, but the strong ones will survive and they'll stay here and they'll figure out a new model. And then in 10 years, we're going to have a flood of more people wanting to get into the thing. But it's the ones that are like slow and steady that kind of figure it out and outpace everybody else, right? So as someone who sits at the intersection of tech and entertainment, like, what are your thoughts of how do you take these models that have worked with other companies and worked outside of Hollywood and get people in this time where everyone's like, I don't know what to do. How do you get them to be open and comfortable to this other pathway?
You know, I think it's a lot like how, like with any kind of innovation, it's probably going to start with a startup or somebody from outside of the industry, like the way that Netflix or, you know, some of these companies started the streaming kind of distribution. So I think it's not going to come from the studio system, because obviously nobody wants to, like, especially people that are profiting very, like, you know, largely from a current system, they're not going to be the ones to disrupt it. So it's going to come from, I believe, a new type of startup that like will propel this type of distribution model, or a new startup studio that is forward thinking enough to be able to put this in place. And I think it's ripe for anybody listening. Like, there are obviously like investors in the venture capital world that are like investing in startups and other industries in this way, that I think there is something to say about, like, if you can kind of put all these pieces together to kind of provide a new model. But I do think it's going to come from like some indie startup that eventually will become an Oscar nominated film or something like that, get the actual, and Sing Sing kind of is a early proponent of that, but I think it needs to not just be at the film level. A startup studio essentially will need to do this. And you know, somebody that is well capitalized enough that can at least get the investment to get dozens, if not hundreds of these films in this model.
How do you reckon, though, with the fact that in traditional VC-backed companies, everyone's just really looking for an exit, and they give you essentially like a very short runway in which to show profits and show real growth? And with what we do, the process of developing and creating takes time to do it right, and it can't quite quantify that. So obviously, no one wants to be spending money forever, but like, to put a limit of like a 5 years, in 5 years, we gotta have an exit. We have to vest. Like, that's where I think it's like the other side of that coin is getting folks outside of this particular aspect of story. And that there is something like, you can't throw everything out. Like, there are aspects of how this industry was built that have clearly worked. And when people are given the time to actually develop and create things, you get really good quality films that stay with people, that last, instead of fast food. You get gourmet, and that takes time. So how do you get the traditional VC mindset into understanding that, so that they too can look at how they're making their investment a little bit more exceptionally to this particular art form?
Yeah, my limited experience now with VCs is that, you know, obviously you're looking to either sell or go public. That's the VC's kind of like mindset. And you have at least 10 years to do that. Like, if you're really thinking of it from a long-term, from a business standpoint. But within that, early on, you need to show momentum and growth. So it's not always monetary in the sense of like, I need to show $100 million like in the next like year. But if you can show other metrics of growth, it's still very possible. And one of the cool things about at least our industry is it's a pretty short window from call it end of product to distribution. Like you basically can, see the kind of like the bell curve from like going to theatrical and doing the streamer deal and all of that. So that part, at least, there's a way to like measure and also see fairly quickly within like 18 months, probably you'll be able to see that. I would say it feels like if you could somehow do that at scale, the biggest thing that you touched on this early on, and I love like how I don't know if you have an actual tech like mindset, but it sounds like it from a lot of what you've been saying. It was with the marketing aspect of it. Most studios, why they do well is because they do P&A well. And so if you're really good at distribution, you're really good at marketing. And so if you can tap into that as this new like startup studio, is that like you can market well, then I think the momentum is there that you can show to essentially be able to like, it's what I think A24 did well with.
They did.
I would say like, they haven't really touched on this part of the model yet, but what they did do well was they took films that wouldn't have traditionally gotten, distribution from the majors, but how they marketed was really the key to their success. They actually took a page out of e-commerce marketing, not traditional P&A marketing. And so they were doing like Facebook ads before people were like hip to like that type of marketing, instead of like spending an enormous amount on billboards or like TV commercials and not being able to track the performance of the marketing. So it's there, and newer studios are starting to, I guess, be more hip to it. Now I think if somebody can just craft the back end model to be this, I think the industry at large will benefit from it. And it's finding what it benefits them.
And once one person figures it out, there'll be a lot of replicas of it, which is, good, I guess, because it creates more competition in that space. But I'll be curious to see what happens with A24 now that they've taken in a very large capital investment. It's like, are they going to have to go public? Are they going to have to change the way they function, to become like they're one of the few companies I think that have really been able to build a brand, like brand loyalty akin to like Disney. There's this, it's like A24 is synonymous with something. It means something to a lot of people, and they're fanatics about A24 who are all about the merch and need to have all the things that they're selling, It's really brilliant. And also the brilliance of A24 is how many projects they have that they do take bets on that don't work, that they are very good at also quietly like just putting away, archiving so that you don't even remember. So when you think of A24, you're like, oh my God, like everything they've put out is like amazing. And it's like, no, they have a lot of flops. They have a lot of things that don't work. We just don't, they are just very good at quietly putting those in the chest.
Exactly. I think that what they've done well is obviously like where more of the major studios will sometimes take a huge gambit on like multiple budget levels. Like, the traditional studio might do a $10 million film and also a $100 million film. Whereas typically A24 has kind of found a sweet spot in this, like, call it lower tier, but it's not low to us, obviously, but still it's like $10 to $20 million range. They now know how to like basically turn a profit on that type of film while still keeping very high brand association and messaging and community building. That's very hard to do, I think, like, and people don't give them enough credit for that, because you would think like with something like Disney, when they're doing that at the $100 to $200 million scale for a film or an IP.
They have to, right? They have shareholders to answer to.
Yeah.
I think also Mubi is one to really keep an eye on. I'm really eager to see what they do. They obviously had one of the largest acquisitions out of Cannes with Don't Die My Love, which they purchased for $24 million. It really is reminiscent of like when Hulu acquired Palm Springs for like $19 million, whatever it was, out of Sundance, however many years ago. And just like really making a play for it. And obviously last year, Mubi with The Substance and how they really doubled down on that. And I'm curious because Mubi is really unique because they're not just a distributor, they're also like a platform, and the way that they started. So I'm just very eager and curious to see like how the Mubi model starts to really inspire, I'm sure it already has, like other companies to start popping up. So look, I feel like it's a very low vibration time in the industry for a lot of people, and it's really easy to tap into that. And certainly, like, again, I'm very real and honest, which is part of my brand, but also just the reality of like doing this work. And it's really easy to fall into the pitfalls of that, certainly when you're like, well, AI is taking over everything and we're going to obliterate all humans. And it's like, yeah, I do think there's a lot of disruption AI is going to cause, but I think we have to get ahead of it. And I do think there's some good things that AI has to offer, certain parts of the process. But I'm also a big proponent, just to end on a positive note, of like, I think we're in a really exciting time for innovation and opportunity, and the people that can process the grief of what was and let go of this idea of what it could have been into looking at, well, what is available to us now are the ones that are going to thrive. And because of the independent entrepreneurial spirit that is required to be in our side of the lane, right, on the margins of the traditional system, I think they're going to be the ones to really be a part of leading that innovation. I think the rise of the independent spirit towards things is what's going to build this V2 of Hollywood, where like there will always be the traditional big studio players, but there's going to be this really exciting new space that we can play in that I think is really, really cool. And I choose to believe that. I choose to be a part of those conversations because they're happening, right? Behind closed doors. I'm a part of a lot of groups where everyone is brainstorming exactly what you said. How do we create something that is representative of the times, of how we can actually continue to do this? Because as a human race, we cannot lose sight of long format stories. Like, we need that for our souls. We need that to find ourselves. We need that to grow and to make sense of our human experience. And it's why, as much as like TikTok and short form content will always be super fun and always here, I don't think it's going to ever really contend with the way that the long form art allows us to reflect and grow and process what it means to be here having this human experience. And so I'm a big proponent of, yes, let's process the grief. That's still very important. But where do we go from here? Where do we go and who do we want to go there with? Right. And so I'm really mindful of who I'm like bringing into my circle in this time of like formation.
Well, Carolina, I'm so grateful that you were here. This conversation was incredible to be able to kind of dive deeper a little bit. Tell us where can our audience find you, and do a little plug for Angle On Producers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for creating space. I think these conversations are really important. And as somebody who hosts my own podcast, it's fun to get to just kind of get lost in a conversation of something I'm really passionate about. And I could talk about for literally another couple of hours if we had the time. But no, angleonproducers.com. The show is Angle On Producers. I'm pretty Googleable. I'm at Carolina Groppa on all the socials. The show's at Angle On Producers. I also will be doing some workshops and some meetups for folks that are in LA this summer. So if you're interested in that, the Substack is the main place where I post a lot of, like, it's the information hub for the show. So check out the Substack. You can find that on the angleonproducers.com website to stay in touch and see, find ways to come meet me, and we can hang and grab a coffee, grab a drink, and do all the things.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Produced With. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. Produced With is brought to you by Saturation. If you're a filmmaker, check out saturation.io, the all-in-one production budgeting, payments, and actualization tool. If you like this episode, subscribe to the show, leave us a review, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. Special thanks to our producer Eugene Wade and editor Stephen Gray for helping shape the conversation and making it sound as good as it does. And hey, check out the show notes. Join the community and find us online.